Hey there guys, so I showed you that AliExpress Firebat A6 mini PC that has a crazy sale going on right now. Well, it actually came in already. I was genuinely not expecting it to arrive so fast, but it was delivered by Amazon of all people. So I don't know what kind of setup Firebat has going on there, but it is a legit listing and it ships fast. So at the price point, this is kind of ridiculous. Now, obviously, we got to take a look at this system. I'm really excited for this because at the price point that this is at, this is an insane value if this turns out to be even half decent. All right, straight off the bat, this is a very nice looking system. It has like a rubberized plastic housing, so it feels nice in the hand, though I don't know how well it's going to age, but aesthetically, it looks nice. It feels solid in the hand. It definitely doesn't feel like a cheap system, which is kind of what I was expecting in all honesty. Design-wise, it's pretty standard for a mini PC, though it does have kind of its own unique flair going on there. I kind of really like the trim that they have here that I'm guessing also acts as ventilation. One of the main concerns that I'm going to have is whether or not this is going to be able to cool the chip that's in here, since it doesn't seem to have the most thorough ventilation. I'm really curious how exactly you open this because there doesn't seem to be a very easy way. I'm hoping we don't have to destroy the feet for that. Either way, the way that it's spec'd out right now, unless you want 32 gigabytes of RAM and a bigger SSD, you should be fine. I mean, it is a full package. It's not a bare bones unit. Okay, immediately, what is this? What is this? The heck? Okay, I gotta know what this is. Okay, what in the heck? It's like a card thing that's in here. What the heck? It's a warranty card. Yeah, it's just Firebat PC factory supports bulk purchases. Apparently it has a 3-year warranty. I can't really attest to... Oh, interesting. Look, it even mentions an Amazon order ID for the warranty. That's so interesting. Yeah, so apparently, at least for Firebat, their shipping is all kind of just done by Amazon stateside. Very interesting that they package it like it's a trading card. All right, power supply wise, gotta check the wattage of this thing. Okay, it's a 120 watt charger. That's pretty great. Even better that it's super tiny. I mean, look at this. I've gotten some absolute bricks when it comes to 120 watts, so this is really nice. I really like this. Just as a point of comparison, here is the last 120 watt brick that I was using. If you compare the size, it's minuscule by comparison. And of course, it's all the standard assortment of things. We got the power cable, small little HDMI cable. I do prefer when they give you a smaller one versus like the big long ones. Outside of that, the packaging is very, very simple. I mean, it just says mini PC. It doesn't really have much of an indicator in terms of model number, except when you look at the tag back here, where it does mention that it is the A6. All right, full body inspection. First of all, I love the fact that it has 4 USB 3 ports on the back. Oh, look, it has like a locking switch. Oh, that might be how you get in. Okay, there's a screw there. I'm guessing if we take that out, I'm guessing if we take this out, it should in theory pop off pretty easily once we unlock it. Oh yeah, it just kind of pops it out. Interesting. Wow, okay, that's really easy to get into. Okay, it has this shroud here. Okay, so this right here was kind of a pain to get out. I essentially put in the screwdriver in there and I yanked it up, but it's because it has a thermal pad that goes over the SSD. Okay, first of all, immediate downside going on here. A single stick of RAM. I'm really glad we opened this thing up because now this kind of changes things because this is going to affect your performance pretty dramatically. I know that with DDR5, it's not as bad as it was with DDR4, but it still is going to have some effect. So we're going to test this thing out since it's just so easy to get into anyway. We're going to test it out as is so you can see the performance like this. The one benefit to this is the fact that you can buy a second stick. And at the price point that this is selling at, even if you buy a second 16 gigabyte stick to throw in here, it's still going to come out cheaper than any similarly configured system with the exact same chip. Now, in terms of the SSD, they do brand it themselves very similar to how Paladin does, but this is interesting. I do have a 16 gigabyte stick laying around, so I can pop this thing in here. This is 5600 megahertz. That doesn't matter. It's going to run at the maximum rated speed of this, which will be 46. So there really shouldn't be an issue with pairing this with that RAM there, at least in theory. When it comes down to things like XMP, there can be some kind of a difference here, but because these are running at JEDEC speeds, it's less of an issue. But let's get this this thing back together in its stock configuration. We're going to test it out, and then we're going to see what kind of a difference we get when we put in the extra RAM. I'm very, very glad that I opened this thing up because I was not expecting to see a single stick of RAM. I shouldn't be too surprised, but it is a little disappointing to see for sure. But what I'm not disappointed with is just how easy it was to get into this thing. That was insanely good. Oh, interesting. The material here feels like soft. That's very odd. I don't know why it feels like that. Okay, it seems to be locked. So when you put the cover back in, you are going to essentially have to open this thing up so that you can fit the hooks in, and then it kind of locks into place. Yeah, so when it's all the way down, it locks in. So again, as I was saying with the IO, we do have the 4 USB 3s in the back. We have the LAN port on the back. I'm guessing that's going to be gigabit. I don't expect it to be 2.5, but I am happy to be surprised with that. We have the display port and the HDMI. I love to see it. I love me a display port. A lot of mini PCs will just go for the dual HDMI, and while that's fine for most people, I am one of those people that enjoys having the display port, so that's great. On the front, obviously, we got power button, we got a headphone audio out, we do have 2 more USB 3s, and we have a USB Type-C. I have to see what this Type-C is like, whether it will support video and charging, or rather power, so gonna have to test that out for sure. But for right now, let's get this thing hooked up and just give it a go. I'm really excited for this. So the first thing that I did on the system was I booted up into the BIOS to see what we can do here, and unfortunately this is a very limited BIOS. I went through all of the different settings here, and I was surprised to see that the Ethernet port is actually 2.5 gigabit, which is really nice to see, but unfortunately in the BIOS you don't really have a lot of control over anything. You can't adjust the TDP, and really unfortunately you can't allocate the VRAM however you want. So we're pretty much just stuck to whatever it is that this system defaults to, because in the BIOS you're really not going to find any options. It's really disappointing. Now the VRAM allocation isn't the most important thing. All it's really there to do is to help you bypass any of those hard locks that will sometimes happen with some games where they'll detect that you have too low a VRAM and they won't launch, even though technically you should be able to play them with this iGPU. But the first game that I ended up testing out was Counter-Strike 2, and this is running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and immediately you can see that the default memory allocation is 512 megabytes. Again, that's not going to affect performance. That's just going to be a hard lock for some titles out there that end up checking how much VRAM you have before they'll even let you launch. But the real downside here is the fact that the performance that we're getting here, while smooth and consistent enough, and it's not exactly a terrible experience for the hardware that we have here, it's not exactly great. And this is really happening just because of the fact that we only have a single stick of RAM. But it is a playable experience, and it's honestly kind of impressive to me how DDR5 does not have that same limitation that DDR4 had, where with DDR4 your 1% lows would end up being disastrous. Here things are for the most part pretty consistent in the frame times, at least with this title. So following up, I took a look at Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord running with the low graphics settings, and here again, not a very impressive result at all. While it is very smooth and consistent and more than playable, for the chip that we have here, this is just not as good of a result as it should be giving. But again, the RAM is a limiting factor here, but you do have that second slot where you can upgrade the RAM, and more importantly really, if you were to get this system right now, it is very comparable to its competition, and it does have that headroom for you to upgrade either immediately or down the line. So next I took a look at Rainbow Six Siege X running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR at the quality preset, that being FSR 2.0, and the results here were again decent enough, but not the level of performance that you would expect out of the 680M. So it's becoming pretty clear that the RAM is a limiting factor here. But the thing that keeps impressing me the most is just how consistent our frame times are. So even though it's less performance than what this chip should be able to do, it's not to the point where it's a horrible experience, which is usually the case that you would expect in a scenario like this, but DDR5 really is a completely different beast. But I don't think any game exemplified how big of an issue this is more than Hitman World of Assassination, where you can see here that the performance that we're getting is pretty abysmal. This is with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we are using FSR all the way down to balanced. And this is, of course, FSR 2.0, and this kind of result is just not great at all. This game would normally be playable on here if we had a proper RAM configuration. This is a pretty demanding benchmark. The amount of particles that end up happening here can be pretty disastrous, but even in that type of scenario, this is just far worse performance than what you would expect here. But still, the frame time charts aren't as bad as I would have expected them to be. It just seems like it's really being brought down overall by the limited bandwidth, and in the scenarios where things normally take a dip anyway due to just the insane amount of particles, this is pretty standard for this chip in general. So while it is lower performance, it's not a catastrophic failure, which is the most surprising. But where does it compare with its competition at this price range? Well, if we compare it with its main price competitor, that being the systems based on the Ryzen 5 6600H, it's not exactly looking great. The 6600H is performing better in CSGO at the exact same graphics settings. While the 1% lows aren't too dissimilar, the FPS average clearly shows an advantage on the 660M side. Of course, this is because it has that dual channel memory, so it just has more bandwidth to work with here. So even though the GPU has less cores and clocks lower, that 680M is essentially being starved. But that 680M also is giving a playable experience. Of course, it's not always the case like this. In Mount & Blade 2 Bannerlord at the exact same graphics settings, they effectively ended up giving the exact same level of performance. A 1 FPS difference is really just a margin of error, so both of these perform pretty much the same in a title like this. And again, that is with the fact that the 680M has that limitation from the RAM. So if you just get a second stick, you are going to see a pretty major boost. And there are some cases where the 680M still ends up taking a lead over the 660M, even though it has that RAM limitation. Rainbow Six Siege X running with the lowest in-game graphics settings and using FSR at the quality preset as we showed before, it ends up beating out the 660M, though not by a significant margin. It does end up winning, so it does show that that extra GPU power can come in handy. It's just going to be very dependent on the title that you're going to be playing, but for the most part, they do seem to be very similar to each other. But it is pretty clear that in the most extreme scenarios, that RAM limitation can hit the 680M pretty hard. As you can see here in Hitman World of Assassination, both of them running at the exact same graphics settings, the performance difference is pretty massive. The 680M is really struggling here and essentially is providing an unplayable experience, while the 660M is actually doing a pretty rock solid job here, all things considered. You're essentially going from an unplayable experience to something that is more than playable. So that could be pretty significant. But clearly it's time to upgrade the RAM on this system. You know, I really love the way that you open this system up. I think that the little switch there is honestly genius. It feels so secure when it's actually in place, and then when you open it, it's just so easy to pop off. Like, that's incredible. Incredible. Firebat is honestly starting to seem like one of the better mini PC manufacturers out there. At least that other system that I took a look at of theirs was great. This one is spectacular. So far, I'm really liking this system, and at the price point that it's at, that's actually insane. All right, and then we just pop it off like that. I do think that this plate should have an easier way of taking it out. Having to essentially use these slots isn't exactly great, because if you see, it is slowly getting damaged, and that could potentially end up causing a short if some of the metal flakes end up hitting somewhere that it's just not supposed to. So I'm definitely going to blow this thing out before I use it, just to make sure that there's nothing in there. But one thing I also forgot to mention when we had opened this thing up the first time is the fact that it has a second M.2 slot right here. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't have a screw for it, so you are going to have to essentially get your own screw, but you can put a secondary SSD in here. So the upgradability of it is honestly looking really rock solid. But let's get the RAM in there. Now, again, it's mismatched RAM. This is 4800, this is 5600. That shouldn't really be a problem because of the fact that this stuff runs at JEDEC speeds anyway. Kind of left the thermal pad downwards. I didn't really intend for that. Hopefully that doesn't cause any issues there. All right, let's get this thing sealed up. Now, one thing that I am noticing though is that there is no cooling system really for the RAM. So I'm curious if having the dual sticks is going to end up introducing problems, because now that's going to be two memory sticks that are next to each other heating up instead of just a singular one that essentially has a little bit more ventilation to it. It also doesn't help that it doesn't really have a thermal pad or anything like that. Maybe you could get a thermal pad similar to the one that was on the SSD and use that to essentially use the metal here as a heat sink similar to what the SSD is doing. But again, we have to see if that's even a problem. The fact that the RAM runs at a lower speed, so not 5600 but 4800, that might end up not being as much of an issue. And of course, the way that you close it is you do have to move the lever back, and then boom, like that, it'll end up locking. Fantastic. Of course, let's put on the screw that goes back here. The good thing is that this screw isn't really necessary. It's pretty secure on there, but honestly, I'm glad that they're playing it safe. No reason to not put it there. So boom, let's see if this even made a difference. And of course, booting into the system and going into the task manager, you can see we have 32 gigabytes of RAM, and it is running at 4800 mega transfers. And of course, to no one's surprise, there is a massive uplift in performance here. You can see that in Counter-Strike 2 at the exact same graphics settings, we are seeing a significant uplift in both our 1% lows and our FPS average. It is now handedly beating out the 660M, and it's performing well within the range that this chip is supposed to. You can see that even though there are some improvements that come from DDR5, where at least the 1% lows aren't super inconsistent, overall our FPS average and 1% lows do take a pretty massive hit. Luckily enough, the system is usable when you get it straight from Firebat, so it's not like it's going to be a terrible experience in comparison to older systems that would effectively become unplayable. It's just you are leaving a lot of performance on the table, but they do give you that extra slot there where you can just upgrade the RAM whenever you want. And of course, this carries over to Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, where we're getting again a massive uplift in performance, and you now have more than enough headroom that you can turn things up from the low settings up to medium. There is a pretty massive jump in terms of visual quality when you go from low to medium, so the fact that we do have the headroom to be able to do that is great. Or if you just want to have a high refresh rate gaming experience in this title, you can just play like this. So you get that flexibility there, but it all comes from that RAM upgrade. And so far, there hasn't been any issues with the RAM overheating. And again, the trend continues with Rainbow Six Siege X, where we see a massive uplift in our FPS average and 1% lows. It becomes a far more playable experience, and it again ends up beating out the 660M. Though this time around, it's not such a massive leap that I would say that you have the headroom to mess around with graphics settings. I would really just recommend that you play like this instead of sacrificing FPS, but it really does come down to personal preference. And of course, Hitman World of Assassination finally becomes a very playable experience on here. So overall, it's very much a worthwhile upgrade to do. You're going to be able to push the performance on a lot of titles to pretty significant levels, and you're going to have the headroom to really start to adjust graphics settings in a lot of titles. But even with the default RAM configuration, I was just more impressed by how consistent the 1% lows were. It certainly limits the amount of titles that you can play, but there's a large selection of titles, especially older games, that you're going to be able to play perfectly fine, and that's really impressive considering it's only a single stick of RAM. But as you could see with Hitman, it is an upgrade that you should really consider doing. But the good thing is that you don't have to do it immediately. If you don't have the money for that RAM upgrade, you can just wait 6 months. You can wait a year from now. You have a functional, powerful system that has headroom. Now, I was concerned about the RAM's cooling, so I really wanted to stress test the system when it came to that. So I ran Time Spy Night Raid on a loop, so it's a 20-run loop. This is a benchmark that was specifically designed for integrated graphics, and as you can see, the iGPU is fully loaded, though the CPU itself isn't really doing a ton. But after the effectively 20-minute run that this was, there was no issues whatsoever with the RAM speed or anything like that. There wasn't the usual stutter that you will see when the RAM is downclocking or anything like that, so there was no issues there. But obviously, this is a canned benchmark that is more designed to push the iGPU than the CPU, so I also wanted to test out a gaming workload that tends to stress out both.
So I put the Hitman World of Assassination benchmark to loop, since it does have an option like that in the settings, and I just left it looping for about an hour. It was a little under an hour, but it was effectively an hour. And right now, just completely ignore the 1% lows and the FPS average. That's all being skewed because of the fact that as it's looping, it does bring up a loading screen, so that affects the 1% lows. These aren't accurate numbers in terms of that, but all you really need to pay attention to is the frame time charts. And we are not seeing the usual stutter that ends up happening when RAM has to downclock itself. It usually ends up essentially looking like little box spikes that end up happening in the frame times, because essentially as the RAM speed has to downclock itself, it slows everything down, and then of course it boosts back up, and it's just going up and down, up and down, up and down, and that destroys your 1% lows, and it overall gives you a stuttery, unusable experience. You can see here that the only times that there are any jumps in the frame times is in those scenarios where there's a lot of particles. This is very normal for it, which means it is just consistently performing the same even after an hour-long loop of this. And also the CPU and GPU temps are very, very good considering the fact that it's been looping like this for an hour. And overall, this is telling me that the RAM is running at a perfectly normal rate. There is no downclocking, there's no issues or anything like that. It's just an overall spectacular result. And I'm really impressed considering the fact that it doesn't necessarily have any kind of active cooling for it, but it doesn't really seem to need it. And I do have to say that another thing that really impressed me about the system is that coming back to it running for an hour, the noise was just pretty much non-existent. My AC unit was louder than it. Even if I turned off my AC unit, the system is really not all that much louder. My Plex server that is in this room right now just makes more noise than that little mini PC does while it's running games. I'm actually really impressed by the cooling system of it.
All right, guys, and that is pretty much the Firebat A6. I'm really impressed with this system, in all honesty. I was kind of expecting to get something that was going to have a little bit of gimped aspects to it, and in some ways it does have that, right? You know, as I showed in the BIOS, you really don't have a lot of control over pretty much anything. So you can't adjust the TDP of this, and you can't allocate more VRAM. Now, as the gaming performance numbers show, that doesn't necessarily really matter, at least in terms of how games are going to perform, but what it does help you with is in those scenarios where there are games that will have a hard lock, where if you don't have enough VRAM, it won't let you launch it at all. Because the way that APUs work is they dynamically adjust their VRAM. So if you need more VRAM, it will simply allocate more of your RAM to it. But the way that it reports to Windows is whatever is the default allocated amount. And in this case, it's only 512 megabytes. Again, this does not affect performance. All it does is prevent you from launching certain specific games. This isn't really all that big of a deal because the amount of games that have this hard lock are pretty limited, but you will run into a scenario where every game is going to tell you, hey, you don't have enough VRAM for whatever settings you want to use, but you can just ignore those messages because if the system has enough horsepower to run it, it will do it. It's not a RAM limitation there. Outside of that though, I love the IO layout. I'm very surprised that the RAM itself never thermal throttled at all. I was kind of expecting to run into that scenario, but as the Hitman looping benchmark showed, there really was no issues at all with the RAM. So this is a fantastic value. Now, there are some, caveats that I do need to say. Of course, you are only going to get 16 gigabytes of RAM, and that is one singular stick. That is going to drop your performance, but it is very easily upgradable, as I showed you, and the performance that it has baseline is still great for its price point, and it has headroom to grow. There is nothing you can do to this system right here that has the Ryzen 5 6600H, which is this thing's biggest competition in terms of price. There is nothing you can do to this thing to get better performance. This, you are one RAM upgrade away from getting a massive leap in performance. So I would say that these two really are pretty comparable to each other at the default configuration, but once you RAM upgrade this thing, it just eclipses this system. And I think that that makes it worthwhile at its price point. Just understand that there are going to be some limitations. Another one of these limitations is of course the lack of Oculink, so you have some headroom for upgrades in terms of being able to put in more RAM in there, throwing in another SSD, but you can't add a GPU later down the line. All in all though, this thing is a fantastic value. It shipped extremely quickly, so if you're interested in picking one of these up, check out the links down below. Get on this deal as quickly as you can if you've been looking for a mini PC in this price range, because there is nothing on the market market right now that competes with this thing. This is the best value that I've been able to find anywhere on the internet. But anyways, let me know what you guys think down below. I'll catch you guys in the next one.